Hi, everyone. My name is Charlotte Tate. I'm the Labor Justice Campaigns Director with Green America. Today, I'm going to be talking to you about our campaign, Toxic Textiles, the harmful chemicals hiding in our clothes. So to start off, I wanted to talk a little bit about the fashion industry as a whole. So the fashion industry takes a huge toll on people on the planet. 10% of global carbon emissions come from the fashion industry. Textile manufacturing accounts for 20% of industrial water pollution. And there's a huge amount of wasted clothing. Between 2000 and 2015, clothing production almost doubled from about 50 billion units per year to over 100 billion units per year. During that same time, the amount of clothing that Americans dispose of annually has almost tripled. On average, Americans dispose of 70 pounds of clothing a year. So what happens to all that clothing we dispose of? The EPA reports that Americans generate 16 million tons of textile waste a year. On average, 700,000 tons of used clothing gets exported overseas. 2.5 million tons of clothing is recycled, but over 3 million tons are incinerated, and a staggering 10 million tons get sent to landfills. So what's that percent breakdown look like? About 62% of clothing gets sent to landfills, and another 18% is incinerated, and a measly 14% actually gets recycled. But why did we choose to focus on toxic textiles? The apparel industry uses 43 million tons of chemicals every year. In addition to this, the apparel industry uses 8,000 different chemicals to manufacture clothing. So we're asking for fashion companies to move away from the most dangerous chemicals and to be more transparent about what chemicals are present in clothing and more transparent about how clothing is made. So this issue impacts both workers and consumers. There are several contact points for chemical exposure. This isn't an exhaustive list, but just wanted to give you a few examples. For raw materials, if you look at cotton, for example, conventional cotton uses a huge amount of pesticides. These pesticides can cause long-term health problems for those working in cotton fields and in the surrounding communities. For manufacturing, workers are exposed to toxic chemicals that are used to treat clothing. If not properly disposed of, these chemicals can poison surrounding communities. And in the final product, consumers can be exposed to residual chemicals that are present in the clothing that you purchase in stores or buy online. So what are some of these chemicals of concern and what are their potential health impacts? So PFCs, these are used to make clothing waterproof and stain-proof. Azo dyes, one of the most common types of dyes used. Heavy metals, they're found in dyes and leather tanning. Formaldehyde, it's used to keep clothing wrinkle-free and shrink-free. Flame retardants, they're used to fireproof clothing, especially children's clothing. And some of the potential health impacts from chemical exposure to these chemicals consist of liver damage, disruption of the hormone functions, carcinogens that can lead to cancer, damage to the nervous system, and respiratory irritation. So I wanted to talk about garment workers as a whole a little bit. More than 70 million people worldwide are employed by the fashion industry, and 85% of these people are women. Globally, there are 170 million children engaged in child labor, with many making clothing. In a recent survey conducted by the Clean Clothes Campaign, 93% of apparel brands surveyed are not paying a living wage. So they're not even paying the basic amount of money someone needs to cover cost of living. And in some cases, workers make as little as 15 cents an hour. Now let's look at global worker exposure to toxic chemicals. Occupational diseases kill one worker every 30 seconds. 80% of deaths from unsafe working conditions are a result of occupational disease. 50% of occupational diseases can be attributed to chemical exposure. And if you look at surrounding communities, if chemicals are not properly disposed of, those communities are at risk, including children that live there or families that live there. And in addition, some waterways near garment manufacturing facilities have become so polluted that they no longer sustain life. So how does all of this impact your health? The chemicals used in clothing manufacturing pollute local waterways and communities, like I mentioned on the last slide. Some chemicals used are called persistent chemicals. This means once the chemicals enter the environment, instead of breaking down, the chemical lingers. Persistent chemicals can travel long distances, so those chemicals that are not properly disposed of on the other side of the world could be tainting your resources too. And additionally, some chemicals remain present in the final product, so you and your loved ones can also be exposed to harmful chemicals used in clothing manufacturing. So in 2019, Green America analyzed the environmental and social practices of major US apparel companies. We looked at things like alternative resources usage, chemical management, if they share a factory list, factory safety, water management, and waste and recycling. Some of the companies that came out on the top were Target, VF, which owns North Face, and Nike. And one of the companies that came out at the bottom is Carter's, which also owns OshKosh B'gosh and has lines of clothing for major online retailers like Target, Walmart, and Amazon. Came out at the bottom. Carter's is the largest US retailer of children's clothing. So when you look at some of the potential risks for children, it's particularly important they step up their chemical management. So what are some of the impacts on children that are exposed to toxic chemicals? Children are more susceptible to the health impacts of harmful chemical exposure. Children are still developing and engage with their environment differently than adults. Children are less able to flush toxic chemicals out of their body. When comparing exposure to body weight, children take in more water, food, and air per pound than adults. So air pollution, tainted resources, and exposure to toxic chemicals can cause more problems for children than adults. So there is good news. There is a lot you can do to help reform the industry. So first of all, you can shop less. This is the most sustainable thing you can do. Second, you can shop secondhand, or if it feels comfortable and safe for you, organize and attend clothing swaps. 3, we recognize that you may still need to buy new clothing sometimes. So you can look for things like, you can look at Green America's Green Business Network members. These are small businesses that prioritize people on the planet. We have several great apparel companies on there. You can look for sustainability certifications like Oekotech, Scott's, or Fair Trade. And while certifications aren't perfect, they are helpful, and they also indicate that you're willing to, that there is a demand for more ethically made clothing. And then on the next slide, I'm going to talk about tips to spot a leader so you can do your own research. 4, if one of your favorite clothing brands is doing poorly on chemical management or another sustainability issue you care about, let them know this is the issue you care about and reach out to them. We have found when consumers speak, brands do listen. So whether it's chemical management or another issue, I would encourage you to reach out to the brand. And then 5, you can use your purchasing power to shop from more responsible brands, creating a greater demand for ethical apparel companies. And then finally, you can take action with Green America. You can go to greenamerica.org/take-action to see all of our actions and petitions. You can take our action asking Carter's to eliminate toxic textiles in its supply chain, among other actions. So what are some tips to spot a leader? I recognize our scorecard wasn't able to cover every US apparel brand, so I wanted to give you some ways to, some tips to do your own research. So you can look to see if a company is measuring its waste impacts, incorporating more recycling and recycled products into its supply chain. You can look to see if the brand is taking part in industry initiatives to help standardize information tracking. see if they have chemical management policies, if they share a public MRSL or RSL, and are they taking part in industry initiatives to phase out the most dangerous chemicals. So I want to talk a little bit about an MRSL and RSL and what it is. So an RSL is a restricted substances list, and then MRSL is a manufacturing restricted substances list. So an RSL, or a restricted substances list, limits what chemicals can be present in the final end product, so what you would buy at a store. An MRSL, or a manufacturing restricted substances list, limits what chemicals can be present in the manufacturing process. So an MRSL would help protect the health and safety of workers and consumers, and an RSL protects the health and safety of consumers. You want to look for companies that have both of these publicly available. So you can also look to see if the company has a water treatment plan and to help clean up the water that's discharged in its supply chain. You can share goals and benchmark, look to see if the company is sharing goals and benchmarks to incorporate more sustainable textiles into its supply chain, and that they aren't limiting these initiatives to one line of clothing or one type of clothing. Oftentimes I see brands that have one line of clothing made with organic cotton, for example. And while that's a good first step, we really need to see fashion brands applying this sustainability effort across the board. So all of their cotton going forward would be organic cotton, for example. And then finally, you can look to see if they're transparent about labor practices and where they source from. So as I mentioned earlier, you can go to greenamerica.org and take our Carter's action or any of our other actions and petitions that are online. So before I end, I wanted to talk a little bit about the impact of COVID-19 on garment workers. COVID-19 has taken a huge toll on garment workers. US and European brands have refused to pay suppliers $16 billion since the beginning of COVID-19. And when the pandemic started, many brands canceled orders that they had already placed with suppliers. Some of these orders, the supplier had already purchased materials, maybe work had already been done on this order, or the order was ready to ship out. And brands canceled and refused to pay for those. And at the same time, some of these brands have paid out millions to shareholders while leaving workers and suppliers to bear the brunt of the burden. Because of this behavior, some workers have been pushed to this point of starvation. Order cancellations and temporary factory shutdowns have left millions without jobs and wages. And because, as we talked about on a previous slide, garment workers are often paid so little, they're not able to save a lot of money up for an emergency like this. They were left in a really dire situation. In addition, the pandemic has provided the opportunity for local employers to union bust. I wanted to share a quote from a garment worker. This graphic is from the Clean Clothes campaign. So Tamru is 22 years old, works at a supplier for the Children's Place. He used to make $27 a month, working 9 hours a day, 6 days a week. Since orders were canceled, the company stopped supplying buses to transport workers to factories, and his wages have been cut in half. So Tamru says, "I can't eat whenever I want to eat. I sometimes skip dinner. I walk from home to work every day because the factory stopped providing transport services, and I can't afford to pay for a bus. My work is so exhausting. I never sit, and the pay is very small to cover my expenses." So in reaction to the order cancellations, groups got together and developed the Pay Up campaign, demanding brands pay for their canceled orders. Green America took part in this campaign, and due in part to consumers, the campaign had some successes, pushing brands to pay up for their orders. In the coming weeks, Green America will take part in the next step of this campaign, so I would encourage you to go to our website, sign up for our email, take action with us, so you can stay in the loop. That's all I have. Thank you so much for joining me today.